The joke is told of four would-be fathers who were waiting in the maternity ward of a local hospital as their wives were in surgery delivering their children. A nurse came out to the first father and said to him, "Congratulations, you are the father of twins." "Wow," said the father, "that's really odd. I work for the Minnesota Twins." A few minutes later, another nurse came out of the OR and said to the second father, "Congratulations, you are the father of triplets." "That's absolutely amazing," said the father. "I work for the 3M company." Not long after, a nurse came out and passed best wishes on to the third father and said, "Congratulations, you are the father of quadruplets." Now that's unbelievable. And that's really spooky because I work for the Four Seasons Hotel. Noticing an obvious pattern with each of the men working at a location that has connection with the number of children they have, the fourth father began to bang his head against the wall. And one of the fathers in the room said, "What's wrong with you?" He said, "I work for 7-Up." Being a father is the most rewarding and at the same time most daunting responsibility that I've ever had. Many fathers that I've talked to, myself included, admit that beneath the bravado that most of us as men have, we sometimes have this silent but crippling fear of not measuring up, not having what it takes to master the role of fatherhood. Maybe the fear of failure or that we will somehow mess up is just natural and it comes with the job, but what does not come with the job, unfortunately, is a simple, easy-to-read instruction manual with information and with advice that can be applied to every peculiar situation and every gifted or not so gifted child. And even if there was such a step-by-step from toddler to teenager fathering instruction manual, as men, we probably wouldn't read it anyway. The Bible does offer instructions in many areas of our life. And when you look at the Bible, though, you will find that there is not one perfect earthly father recorded in the Bible. David was an author. He was a great warrior. He was a king, and he was a father. But David demonstrated some of the same weaknesses that all of us as humans struggle with. Solomon, it seemed, was too busy with his 700 wives and 300 concubines that I'm sure he didn't have much time to spend with his children. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Israel asked God that they would have a king, the prophet Samuel said, "God, why don't you use one of my sons?" And the people of Israel said, "No, we don't want any of your sons because they're gangsters. They bribe people and they pervert justice." So as much as Samuel was a good prophet and he was a good person, he did not excel in being a good father. So where in Scripture can we find an example or examples of inspiration for those of us who aspire to be good fathers? The story that I read for you in Luke is such an example. Luke, the 15th chapter, is a classic literary work filled with the awareness and insights of two sons and the relationship that they had with their fathers. It is probably one of the most well-known told stories of Jesus. In the story, we encounter a father who exhibits some of the qualities I believe most good fathers aspire to develop in their life. And through the father in the story, tremendous love, tremendous acceptance, and tremendous compassion is illustrated by an earthly father, and also sheds light on the love, the compassion, and the insight that God demonstrates and extends to each of us. The story is commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son, but it could just as easily be called the parable of the loving, compassionate father. It is in the response to both of his son's actions with extravagant love that for me makes the father in this narrative, and not the careless or angry sons, the hero. Let me give you just a little bit of an overview of the history of this parable for anyone here who might not be familiar with it. A father had two sons, and they worked in the family business for many years. And one day, the youngest son, believed to be in his late teens, decided that he wanted to venture out on his own. He wanted to leave his dad's family business. He'd been there long enough. He'd learned all he needed. He wanted to exhibit or spread his oats, or he wanted to sow his oats. He wanted his independence. So he requested to take his stock options early, which would allow him to have enough capital to begin his life on his own. And according to the Jewish law, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 7, the firstborn child would receive 2/3 of the family inheritance. So the younger son, I heard my oldest daughter say, That was just classic. And you know why that was classic? Because as the youngest child in the family, I have some problems with that math. Because that means every child afterwards would just get 1/3 of the family estate. The division of the family estate ordinarily took place at the death of the father. And although there were uncommon but unusual circumstances that would allow for an early withdrawal, just like in your case and mine, when we take money out of pre or non-taxed accounts, then when we take them out too early, we have a penalty to pay. And there was a penalty for this son to get his early withdrawal. There's a certain self-centeredness, a certain heartlessness, a certain disrespect and disregard in the request of this younger son. It's not only disrespect and disregard towards his father, but also towards his younger brother. The English word that is translated estate, he said, I want my portion of the estate. And the English word that is translated from the Greek estate means life. I want my portion of your life. I want my portion of what you have for me. In essence, what the younger son was saying, you're already dead. So give me what belongs to me. And by demanding his share and leaving, the younger son, with no regrets, he cuts all ties with his family, and he takes everything with him. And there's no realistic hope in the text that he ever plans to come back home. His departure with a generous share of the family estate also means that there is a loss to his father and his older brother. The younger son, with his inheritance in hand, left the family farm, left the country, and he wasted no time to freely spend all of his inheritance. He bought 2 new camels, a beach house on the Dead Sea. He hosted lavish parties and picked up all of the bar tabs whenever he went out. He had a good time while it lasted. But you know what they say, all good things must come to an end. And eventually, he spent every single penny of his inheritance, and he found himself homeless, starving, barefoot, alone, and in a foreign land. Extravagant spending and freeloading friends and a stock market crash all made for the perfect storm that landed this young man in a place he never anticipated and doing things that he would have never envisioned. It just so happened, I don't know how that happens, but it just so happened that when his funds ran out, so did his friends. My father calls those kinds of friends fair weather friends. My mother is not as nice. She called them bloodsuckers. In desperation and to avoid starvation, he did as any reasonable person would do. He looked for a job. And unfortunately for him, due to the inflated housing market and some very bad banking practices, the country was experiencing a recession. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the U.S., not, I need to come back. Unemployment was so high that the only job that was available for him was feeding swines, feeding pigs. Swines were considered unclean animals, according to the Leviticus law in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 7. And no Orthodox Jew would have anything to do with swines. For the Hebrew, caring for swines or caring for pigs called to mind the idea of loss of everything that once identified them as a member of the family of God. And so when the resources and when the friends run out, his misfortune bring him to the place where the King James Version says he came to himself. The Good News Bible said he came to his senses. He's not only humiliated, but he's also humbled by this experience. Out of desperation, he returns after spending time feeding the swines, after spending time in the hog pens. He returns home and he asks his dad to make him a hired servant. Now that's interesting because even in servitude, there was several layers. So you have the bond servant that's up here where they're slaves, but they're really considered to be almost a part of the family, maybe indentured servants who are working in order to pay off a debt. And then you have the servants who are really assistants to the bond servants. But at the bottom of the pecking order, at the bottom of the totem pole was the hired servant, the lowest of all rank. And that's the approach that this son takes as he returns home. God, Father, make me a hired servant. Much like day laborers who have no benefits and sometimes are treated with disrespect in our world today, and they're poorly paid, hired servants were rented or employed by the day, and at any moment, without any reason, for any cause, that person could be fired. The life of a hired servant was unstable. The life of a hired servant was uncertain and insecure. Much like what happens today when a person is reported missing, some scholars suggest that this father had been returning to this point where his son departed and having a vigil every single day that he was gone. Every day he went back to the same spot, looking and hoping and praying and wishing that his son would come home. And the text reads that day that he went looking for his son, and he saw his son in the horizon. He saw his son far off. He didn't wait for the son to come to him, but rather he ran to the son and he kissed him. He met him and he hugged him. The son can't even get through his rehearsed speech because his father interrupts him and recalls the love that he has for him. The son remembers only the sin, The father remembers only the love. He's stripped of his speech. His father interrupts and arranges a different kind of reception with 4 significant gestures. For his son's loss of dignity, the father presents him with the finest robe, which represents honor and dignity. For his son's hands that had wasted an entire inheritance, the father gives him a signet ring that reinstates him into sonship position, reinstates him with authority as a part of the family of God. For his son's bare feet, his father placed sandals on him because only slaves walked around without shoes. Those who are in the family wore shoes. For his son's empty stomach, the father planned a feast that was fit for a king. A robe, a ring, a pair of sandals, and the feast. Not only symbols of forgiveness, but also symbols of restoration. They're gifts of grace given to an undeserving son by a loving father. There's no mention in the text of accusation. There's no mention in the text of allegation. The father lays out no plan of restitution or a timetable by which the returning son had to prove himself worthy to re-enter the family. It appears that the most important thing to this father was the relationship with his son. About 15 years ago, when I was serving a congregation in Scottsdale, Arizona, I was the pastor for men's ministry, and we hosted a monthly men's breakfast. And at this particular men's breakfast, there were about 200 men present, and I invited one of the men of the congregation to be the speaker. And he said something that has stayed with me for 15 years. He was talking about the 5 children that he has. And he said that my children will do many things that will upset me. He said, my children will do many things that will disappoint me. But there's nothing that my children will ever do that will make me stop loving them. The relationship with his son was the most important thing. The father doesn't lay out a plan of restitution. Father doesn't lay out a timetable by which, okay, after you do this and this and this, then I'll recognize you as my son again. After you do this and this and this, then you can have re-entry into the family. It appears that the most important thing for the father is the fact that his son, who was dead, was now alive. The son is more important than anything he has done. The story would be complete with the return of the wasteful father, the reckless son, and the father's open arm acceptance. But there's another story that's going on within this story. And that's the story of the older son. The older self-righteous son who is resentful, who's angry, who's upset that his father would so willingly and so openly receive back this son who had betrayed everything that represents family. This son wants justice. This son wants this younger brother to pay for what he had done. The older son cannot get beyond the correctness and is trapped into his own righteousness. The father doesn't deny the faithfulness of his older son, but the father implies that if you had been the one that left, I would be doing the same thing for you. As fathers, or as a father, we're always making memories, always leaving a legacy. It could be memories or a legacy of involvement, or it could be memories or legacy of being absent. And sometimes the image we hold of our earthly father and the image we create for our children can be changed for bad or for good in a because of life experience. Can change that image in a because of life experience that we share with our children. It's probably safe to say that through this experience, the father learned something about himself. And I would imagine that those two sons not only learned something about their father, but they also learned something about themselves. We have in the text to really use our imagination to fill in the blanks to the story. Because the truth is, there's a lot that the text doesn't tell us. We don't know what kind of family business they owned. We don't know where they were born. We don't know what type of work they engaged in, how old they were, how they acquired their wealth, how this father was able to set aside that inheritance for his children. Nothing is said of his wife or the boy's mother, or if they had any extra children. We're not even told the names of the individuals in the story. You see, none of those things that we attach to fame and or success or position are mentioned. No name, no rank, no serial number, nothing is given. But what we do know from the text is the actions and the interactions of the son and their father. And three things the father does that makes me say, I want to be a father like that. The father spent time with his son. The father was both fair and firm. And the father displayed compassion. I guess the father could have said, wait a minute. I see my son coming home. He made a bad choice. He ruined his life. He messed up the family dynamics. I guess the father could have said that. And when you read the story, you have to think in terms of what is Jesus trying to communicate here? And I would suggest to you that Jesus is at least trying to communicate one point here, that the way this father in this story treats his son is the same way that God treats you and me. When we've made bad choices, when we wasted our life, when we squandered our health, misused our God-given talents and ability, have run away from God, are long away from God, doing things, saying things that God is not pleased with, hanging out with people who are dragging us down rather than pulling us up, clinging to images of ourselves rather than to the image of God. What does God do? God doesn't wait for us to come, but God runs. God meets us where we are. And God says, I want you back home. I want you back home. I want you back home. And when I read that story, I said, I want to be a father like that. Amen. Hi, I'd like to thank you for worshiping with us this morning via the internet. And I'd like to invite you to come and worship with us in person at our sanctuary. 15905 West Sunset Boulevard is our location, and we'll have a seat waiting for you. You can also visit us at www.plc.cc if you'd like to view other messages. Thanks again. Have a blessed day.